Greetings! Today we come to you with a special episode of AfreeQa, the new Pan-African TV show on Arts TV. Today we're going to be celebrating ADWA. It would be the 126th celebration of ADWA, an African victory. I have a great guest for you. What do you think were the initial causes of the European attempt to colonize, enslave, exploit and dehumanize the whole world?
It's a very appropriate question when it comes to ADWA. So we have to do some historical background a little bit. God favors these people too. They were not cursed like white supremacy taught them. White supremacy was based on the Hamitic curse. First ideological victory that was brought about by the ADWA victory was a complete erasure of this white supremacist idea of Hamitic cursedness. Twice Europe was defeated because of that faith that humanity is much bigger than a slave, is much bigger than a colonizable being, is much bigger than a being who could just be conquered and become your servant. This thing is in the faith that we have here. Our belief is what God dictated. What did God dictate? All of you are one. Humanity was created. There is one father, one mother. That is like a big lesson.
Greetings! Today we come to you with a special episode of AfreeQa, the new Pan-African TV show on Arts TV. Today we're going to be celebrating ADWA. It would be the 126th celebration of ADWA, an African victory. I have a great guest for you and I will allow him to introduce himself. Thank you for coming.
My name is Tewodros Aklilu. I'm a musician, researcher and Pan-Africanist. So I think that describes it.
Perfect. So we welcome you. So we're going to go straight into our question and discussion about ADWA and Pan-Africanism, ADWA and the rest of Africa. What do you think were the initial causes of the European attempt to colonize, enslave, exploit and dehumanize the whole world?
That's a big question. I think, though, it's a very appropriate question when it comes to ADWA. So we have to do some historical background a little bit. Let's hope it's not too long. To describe how we came to this moment, to ADWA, how the world came to the moment of ADWA. And I think we'll have to mention the Ottoman and Portugal global power struggle as a starting point. The Ottoman Turk Empire was, I would say, uncontested for a long period of time in terms of their colonies in the Middle East, Near East, which is Turkey now, and Greece. I would say the whole Eastern Mediterranean region. I would say North Africa and Mediterranean, not so far west, but Mediterranean up to Morocco, let's say. And then the entire Red Sea, coastal regions on both sides, and the Indian Ocean trade, basically. So the Ottomans were controlling that, and the Portuguese Empire, which has not yet formed, but which was the first part of the Spain peninsula to be free. It's on the west side. So that part of Spain, which first became free, became Portugal. So Portugal was lucky to have maritime technology that it inherited from the Moorish colonizers of the Spanish peninsula. Moorish are basically North African and from Senegal up to Libya. That's the Moorish nation. And Northern Sahara, what we call the Tuareg now, that's the Moorish nation. So Moorish nation was the one colonizing for about 700, 800 years. And they had adopted Islam. They had adopted some Arab culture. And their base culture was Berber or Tamashek. Tamashek is their indigenous name. And Berber is what the Romans called them. So those people, they spoke a language very similar to Ge'ez and Amharic and Orominya and Chadic, and basically that's where their language is classified. And they are basically, they call it Afro-Asiatic, and I will call it Kand. That's the name I'll use for that language group because it's more appropriate. So whenever I say Kand language group from now on, you should know it's what the Europeans refer to as Afro-Asiatic. So they speak Kand languages, similar to the Chadic people, the Hausa people. And this group, what we call Kand, did not arrive at European colonization until the Suez Canal was cut. So when we discuss the Ottomans and the Portuguese, we have to understand that their power struggle came to Ethiopia in the form of the Lubna Dingil versus Graing Ahmed. That was the Portuguese Ottoman power struggle that you could call it a proxy struggle. And that struggle was inconclusive in the sense that the Portuguese nor the Ottomans were able to bring in the kind of troops that they wanted to bring in to make colonization possible. The Portuguese had a very easy time in Angola, as you could see. The Portuguese had a very easy time in Somalia. The Portuguese had a very easy time in Mozambique. They had a very easy time in Senegal, Ghana. And the Suez Canal made it possible for European colonizers to bring in large amounts of warships in both directions. And the Suez Canal made the Ottomans, more or less, it defeated the Ottomans because Europe was now able to bring in as many ships as they could manage. And the Genoans and the Venetians helped the Portuguese a lot. And all the European powers used the Genoan know-how for shipbuilding and such things. So the one thing Europe had going for it, which made it possible to colonize Africa, was unity, a pan-European mindset. They realized very early that unless they thought pan-European, they could not succeed in defeating the Ottomans. So the first, you could say, victim of European unity was the Ottoman Empire. So, as I said, the Ottoman Empire attempted to set foot in Ethiopia after it conquered Egypt, after it conquered Sudan, after it conquered Mecca, Medina, after it conquered Yemen. They couldn't conquer Ethiopia except the coastal areas. So they had Mitsua and Harar. That's what they succeeded to conquer. They succeeded to conquer Somalia, but they couldn't come to the highland area. So that's the one thing that saved Ethiopia. But the reason Europeans wanted to conquer the whole world was because they could. They had the technology too. And I don't think if Africans had that technology, they would not do the same. So you cannot blame Europe, or they could not say that they are less moral or they're not ethical. I think they were able to do it and they did it. And Ethiopia was able to resist, and therefore it did. I mean, that's where the story comes. Everybody does what they're able to do. So what happened was, in my opinion, Europe, with the Portuguese naval power, was able to conquer Africa round the Cape of Good Hope, go to India and conquer the west part of India. They were able to go to Indonesia. They were able to go conquer that part of the world. They were able to go into the Pacific. They were able to go all the way into China, west, by the west side. That's a big span of ocean to be able to go comfortably. They were able to go to Brazil, and they were able to conquer 4 oceans, which means that the technology which made that possible is responsible. Once they had the technology, then they say, we can do this, let's do this. So they conquered all this, and their trade empire rivaled the Silk Route, what the Chinese had over land. They were able to rival that. They were able to rival the Venetians. They were able to rival the Byzantine Empire, which until that time conquered the trade through the Venetians and the Genoans. So that's the story in a nutshell. The Europeans wanted to conquer the world because they could, because they now had the technology. They had the shipbuilding know-how. And now they started going to, how can we, because if we think about it, Ethiopia was the first one to send ambassadors to Europe, not Europe to Ethiopia. Okay, we have to know that. Ethiopia was the one saying, let's explore the world, and sent ambassadors to Venice, to the Vatican, and to Egypt, and to Jerusalem.
This was when?
This is in the 13th century.
13th century. Okay.
Why? Because they could.
I mean, granted, it's okay to do things because you could, but when you go that extra step, like enslaving, dehumanizing the African people, do you think that was okay? That can't be okay.
I'm not saying it's okay.
Yeah.
But I'm saying if Africa was the one with this power, it might have done it too. It might have.
I don't know.
When the Arabs were able to do it, they did it. When the Turks were able to do it, they did it. And when the Moors were able to do it in Spain, they did it.
Okay.
So Spain was, you could say, essentially colonized for 700 years. So was that colonization more humane? Is a debatable issue because they were able to continue their religion. They were able to continue with Catholicism in Spain. And when the Moors left, it continued right after that. So it was not imposed on them. So African colonization might not have imposed its religion. Okay. It might have been a more benevolent. And the enslavement that Europe did to Africa coincided with Europe's need for labor in the New World. So then when Spain was colonizing the Azores and the islands in the Mediterranean and Madura, and they started their sugar cane plantations there, they didn't have enough workers. So guess who the first slaves were? They were white slaves that they bought from the Ottomans. They were Albanian Christians. They were Serbian Christians. They were Slavic Christians that the Russians first started enslaving, the Russian Empire. The Rus Vikings, basically, they are the ones who eliminated the Jewish it was a Jewish-Turkish kingdom, basically. They were Turks who converted to Jewish, called Khazars, and they basically started the trade that the Ottomans inherited later. So this Khazar Empire in what you could call the different Bajans, Azerbaijan, and different stans that existed, the Turkish empires under Russia. Even Ukraine had slaves taken from it. And what that said was there was slavery going on, starting with the white slaves even the word Slavic is slave. So to make a long story short, the European story did not start with the Renaissance. We have to go back. We have to go back. We have to go to the Moorish conquest of Spain. We have to go to the Ottoman conquest of Byzantium on two sides of Europe that affected European history. Europe probably thought colonization is normal because it was colonized twice, one by the Moorish Muslims and one by the Turkish conquest of Byzantium. So colonization was a normal part, I think, of their existence. And they were equal players at that time. So when did, I'm getting to your question now.
Thank you.
Because this context needed to be there, because they are not like evil people. They are human like everyone. But this historical accidents that happened to Europe and around Europe started a self-search in Europe, in Italy, in Florence, around the question of who are we? Because Europe did not have an ancient pedigree. It was mostly Franc means Frankish people. So that's what we call Franc. That was mostly a Franc phenomenon where Franc said to Vatican Roman Empire at the time, they said, no, this is not how we want to be. And Christianity, the Vatican Christianity was not fully absorbed by the Franc people. So the Franc people destroyed Rome and put an end to the Roman Vatican Empire that existed until that time. So the Franc themselves, who became Germans later, half became French, half became German. So the one was called East Franc, one was called West Franc. So East Franc is German, West Franc was France. So we have to understand it like that. So this became the Holy Roman Empire, and they took over the Roman Empire itself, and the Roman Empire itself, when it was conquered by the French, put its headquarters in France, Avignon, different places. And during this time, various people, this is the time the Vatican was weak, so various people said, who are we? What's our past? Do we have an ancient pedigree? Like the Ottomans, like the Arabs, like the different other huge, big people around the world, like the Chinese, the Indians. So they were looking for this, and Renaissance basically was when Europe discovered ancient Egypt, ancient Greece. Ancient Egypt is basically ancient Greece, where it began. And Greece is basically Egypt in Greek language. Basically, that's what it was. So their gods came out of Egypt, and they were given Greek names, and their epic stories, everything, you could find ancient Egyptian. So we'll call from now on Egypt Kemet. Kemet was the name, indigenous name that they chose for themselves. So we'll call that part Kemet. So when I say Kemet, understand, we're talking about ancient Egypt, before the Greeks adopted their culture. So that culture was discovered by Renaissance Europe, and that brought about a big change in Europe. That brought about a very big confidence. And then the Ottoman Empire and the Andalusian Empire in Spain and the Arab world and the culture that they brought to Egypt, to Europe, brought about a lot of technical changes, technological advances, such as the printing press, such as the standing water mill that eventually brought about the Industrial Revolution in England. They brought about language. A lot of experts, especially German linguists, were going to places like Ethiopia, places like the Middle East, where they adopted a lot of linguistic technology. Goethe gave a lot of linguistic technology to German. So these are things we need to examine and our scholars need to examine these things and teach our people. So we have to understand that these technical changes brought about a very good standard of living. And then we have to also remember that the Black Death, which is a very killer pandemic, which wiped out, you could say, half of Europe, brought about unexpected young population. Even though there was a lot of death, it was a lot of old people who were killed. And a lot of young people found themselves in Europe with abilities, with technology, with linguistic abilities, with inheritances from Andalusian universities, Paris University, and other universities, which kept growing. The one thing about Europe is they learn from the past. They keep growing on the past. They keep growing on the past. They do not come in and eliminate from zero like the Chinese do. The Chinese, whenever a new dynasty came in, they changed everything. They changed the calendar, they changed the music scales, they changed everything. It started from zero. So Europe did not do that. Europe always built on this past generation which left. So to make a long story short, Europe found itself an inheritor of a young population because of disease, unfortunately. It found itself with a pan-European mindset. It found itself with technology, which it necessarily didn't invent, but knew how to adopt to its uses. And it found itself with Ottoman military weapons, which it was able to adopt and change and make better use of, including defeating the Ottomans. So these things made Europe able to conquer the rest of the world. And wherever they went, a few people with muskets could conquer a whole number of people. We saw some of it among the Grand Lebanon struggles, where a few muskets hidden in trees were able to take out generals, as much which were being killed in large numbers, and people didn't know what was killing them. And this sharp shooting made all the difference. So this was done in every African society that the Portuguese came to. And the Portuguese taught the rest of Europe that 100,000 people could be defeated by 10,000, by 5,000. And this brought about a very different world. So Europe now was able to conquer all of Africa, the coastal areas. And 1869, the Suez Canal was cut. So Europe doesn't have to turn all around Africa to go back into the Mediterranean. It could now go straight from Europe into the Red Sea. So they were able to set up conquests all over the coast of the Red Sea on both sides. They were able to set up coastal conquests in Somalia, in Eritrea, in Djibouti, in Kenya, in Tanzania, in Mombasa, all the way to South Africa. And then in 1884, the Treaty of Berlin, they were able to have a pan-European understanding where they were able to gather the 6 or 7 powers and say, we have now coastal settlements and a few inland settlements. So let's agree that whoever could conquer inland from the coasts, nobody else would contest it. None of the other Europeans would contest it. And the Treaty of Berlin happened, but to have the Treaty of Berlin happen, there was one thing that changed everything, which was Darwin. Charles Darwin came in and he taught a biological lesson. He taught about how species evolved, how species changed. Even within the last 100 years, human beings have changed. We're taller and different kind of situations compared to the last 100 years before that. So this change that happened in humans, Darwin's biologic theory was applied to society, to social beings. And then they said, those beings in Australia, they are on a lower level of human evolution. They said, here is monkeys, here is those Australians, here is the African pygmies, here is the Negroes. They said Negroes to Africans because they wanted to differentiate them from the Hamites. The Hamites are the people they saw what they conceive as civilization. They saw as pyramids, and they say they saw black people there. They saw these amazing monuments in Lalibela, and they saw black people there. They saw these amazing monuments in Zimbabwe, and they saw black people there. So it's very important that we understand this long background to why Europe dared to come to our continent to conquer us. Mm-hmm. So we have to understand that. We have to understand that they had all these things built up into their scenario. So that last strand called white supremacy came from this Darwinian, social Darwinian scenario. Darwin never said it, by the way. We have to acknowledge that. It was other people who came in and said, we could apply this theory to human society, and said Africans, Negroes, Hamites, then they said Cushites came in before Hamites, and then they created this layer.
Was it by color they differentiated them, like by the color of their skin, by their
They differentiated by the brain size.
Oh.
Social Darwinism basically started in Germany, and they measured skull of the monkeys, orangutans, and different creatures, beings, primates, humans, and then they said, based on skull size, this is higher on the evolution ladder. And whenever they found exceptions, such as Hamites, they said they are Caucasians. They said they are Caucasians. And they brought about conflicts which we still have. When in Ethiopia we have people bickering about, I am Cushitic, I'm Semitic, I'm Hamitic, and all these things, we have to understand that these were rat traps that we fell into. These are rat traps. Rat trap, the cheese that is put in the rat trap is called ethnicity. Because we all, ethnicity exists. We all have it. We all have families. We all have extended families. We all have nuclear family, and then uncles, aunts, and then we have our village we came from, and then that village expands to an Auraja we came from, and that expands to a bigger unit we came from, and maybe that went to a kingdom in some cases, and that is the source of the cheese that we all keep falling into. So for our later discussion of Pan-Africanism, let's understand that a lot of our ethnic conflicts, the modern ethnic issues, whatever the historical causes were, is highly exasperated by the theoretical frameworks which we find ourselves into, which were developed during this European period of self-discovery, where they needed to put themselves at the highest. They need to put themselves at the highest. Therefore, they said, all these beings came. We have Hamites, we have this, then we have these other beings in the intermediate being in the middle, and then in the end, we have the Germans. So that was the thinking that was developed by the German philologists in Germany during the time of the Treaty of Berlin. And when we come to ADWA, we have to have all this background in mind, because white supremacy was at its highest when ADWA happened. White supremacy had convinced the whole world scientifically that this way of looking at the world, this way of looking at human grades of humanity, starting from monkeys to humanity, all these things were scientific during their time, and that was on the mind of the Italian soldiers when they came here during ADWA.
So we're back after listening to Lucky Dube's One Color, and I also want to say I hope everybody's having a wonderful celebration of the 126th ADWA celebration today. So you picked One Color. Can you tell us why you picked One Color by Lucky Dube?
Yes, happy ADWA to you too.
Thank you.
Happy ADWA victory to you too. Lucky Dube's One Color is very significant. The world was going towards one color, this blending.
Yeah.
This is what Portugal discovered in Brazil. So Brazil became one color. If we look at India before this group from Persia came in, was freely mixing for thousands of years. And therefore, when they looked at them genetically, they didn't find differences. Ethiopia, which I think is the first multi-ethnic nation, was coming towards one look, was coming towards one, like whether you go to Hammer, whether you go to northern Ethiopia, there is a look that he could identify as Ethiopian, Somali included, Sudan included, Kenya included, Rwanda included, and Chad included, and Hausa, Nigeria, Fulani, all these groups, the Tuareg, these groups included. I would say it was a result of a mixing that happened before our memory. It wasn't written in the history books, and therefore we forgot. And now one is Cushitic, one is Hamitic, one is Semitic, and all this confusion. It's one people. So one color is very significant, because if we don't have these interferences such as white supremacy and other kind of situations, the world would be going towards one. That's what one color means. The world would be going towards one, and that's what would happen if you left it organic, if we don't interfere.
Thank you.
Okay.
So going to our second question. What is the legacy and the significance of the Battle of ADWA for the African continent and for the African people?
That's a great question, because a lot of Ethiopians who I'm talking to do not see ADWA as an African victory. And a lot of Africans do not even know about it. Other Africans that I'm talking to, that in my experience, very few conscious people know about it because it was taught to them. But in general, it's a local event that happened in Ethiopia, as a lot of people understand it. And it is not. ADWA is where white supremacy was put to a stop. We have to understand that. White supremacist thinking said the primary example of my superiority, that's what Europe, the French was saying. The primary evidence of my superiority is that I could militarily beat everybody and take over their land whenever I want. And ADWA said, no, stop. And if we think that stopped in Ethiopia, we are very mistaken, because I have a very long explanation. Can I get into it? Or should we get into it as we go?
As we go
along?
maybe.
But it is not simply Ethiopian victory. It is not a simply African victory. India paid attention to ADWA. China paid attention to ADWA. Indonesia paid attention. Vietnam paid attention to ADWA. All those nations under conquest, under colonization, by white supremacist state, one or the other, paid attention to this victory. Because this victory happened with spears, mainly spears and shield, a few guns, but big heart. Big heart is a major requirement for ADWA. And that message went all around the world. And that's why ADWA is significant.
Why do you think ADWA was successful?
The reason ADWA was successful, in my opinion, was the fact that Ethiopia had a very organized religious structure and a very organized state structure. And if we think that the king or the monarch is an exploiter or feudal or this and only that, then we miss all of ADWA. All of ADWA happened because we had an emperor that had the allegiance of a whole people. And even people who had issues with Emperor Menelik said, this issue is bigger. This issue would mean that I would not have a wife tomorrow. I would not have my land tomorrow. I would not have my country tomorrow. I would not have my religion tomorrow. So people saw the significance of following that emperor and keeping that empire going. So that is very significant. And today when we think about it, that is exactly what we don't have. We do not have that central authority that had the allegiance of the people as ADWA. We do not have that strong religious center, which was very central to galvanizing the people. All the emperor had to say was, he's going to come after your land, your religion, your wife. So if you want to defend those, get up and defend it now. Million people responded. So that's what's missing in Africa now. That galvanizing force, that's ancient, that is powerful, and that is proud. We should not be afraid to be proud. We should be proud of our kings, our leaders, our countries, our flags. That is exactly what is responsible for ADWA, and that's what Europe went after. And I think they succeeded. So we need to rebuild these institutions back. I'm not saying let's have a king. I'm not saying let's have the feudal structure again. I'm just saying let's have a strong structure that we could galvanize around. You could call him king, you could call him prime minister, you could call him whatever you want. But this strong structure that we could galvanize around, we need if we're not going to be colonized again, which might happen if we do not set these things up. If that makes sense.
Yes, it does. Yeah. So we're going on to our next question. Okay. Ideological fruits were born from seeds sowed at the Battle of ADWA.
Yes.
Those seeds sprouted across the Atlantic Ocean, where African Americans were living under colonial subjugation by Jim Crow laws and institutional white supremacy, as well as across the Indian and Pacific Ocean, where various Asian people were living under similar subjugation by these same European powers. What were these ideological fruits?
Great question. I would say the biggest ideological fruit is a reformist movement. I would say ADWA started a reformist phase of African liberation. We could say African liberation had 3 phases. So this way we can encapsulate our conversation in a very neat way. Okay. The first phase is a reformist phase, which was triggered by the Battle of ADWA and the victory there over white supremacy. It was not just a victory over Italian military force. It was a victory over white supremacy. We have to understand it as that. The ideology of white supremacy was got a physical response from inferior people. And that brought about big change in European science. But the biggest change happened in Africa, where a reformist phase was started. Later, it was called Ethiopianist spiritual movement. But a lot of African people who were under colonialism followed the Bible. And there was a significant education that happened after the Battle of ADWA, where people said, this African country which defeated Europe, who is this country? It's a beginning of knowledge first. Everybody just knows about their village, their little community, and their side of the world. You know, at the most, we would know about West Africa. But this was the first time people in the Caribbean, people in Africa, people in China said, what is this? How did they achieve this? And then that led them to the Bible, because all of them have seen that word Ethiopia in their Bible. And that word Ethiopia, it was just a word until the Battle of ADWA, I believe. For many Africans and many subjugated Asian people, because Ethiopia became concrete. And they said, this name that was mentioned in the Bible over 40, 50 times, and then under other names, it's still there. How come it was able to defeat? And then a lot of spiritual movements said that is because God found favor. God favors these people too. They were not cursed like white supremacy taught them. White supremacy was based on the Hamitic curse. The Hamites were cursed. That is, they made a lot of people believe that. That was straight up the first bone of white supremacy. The first point that white supremacy clutched was the Hamites are inferior and the Semites are superior. So they brought in something to divide Hamites and Semites. And that's eventually led to the other white supremacist ideas. Okay? So you could say that was the beginning of white supremacy, or the idea that white supremacists clamped on. And this victory destroyed that. In a physical way, it destroyed that. And therefore, the first ideological victory that was brought about by the ADWA victory was a complete erasure of this white supremacist idea of Hamitic cursedness. Okay. And therefore, they will not inherit God's kingdom. They are meant to be the slaves to the whites. All this thinking came out of that. So ADWA destroyed that. So the reformist phase of African liberation was brought about by ADWA. I'll leave it at that.
Okay, thank you. Do you think that Ethiopianism is the foundation of Pan-Africanism?
Very good question. And it would lead right into the next thing I was going to say. Because Ethiopianism is basically the ideological name for this reformist phase of African liberation. So when did Pan-Africanism start? I would say that started with the Ethiopian victory over the fascist Italian invading force, which came 40 years after ADWA. And that led to the revolutionary phase of African liberation. And the revolutionary phase of African liberation, at the heart of it is Pan-Africanism. And it was Pan-Africanism which took this movement all the way to, I would say, the formation of the OAU, which is a culmination of the revolutionary phase of African liberation. So ADWA brought about the reformist phase and the 5-year struggle of Ethiopians under incredible odds, under crazy odds. Like, it's almost impossible. They had the planes, we didn't have any planes. They had all these machine guns and all kinds of machines. They had the ships that brought in reinforcements. And all these things were defeated by, again, heart. This is a second lesson. ADWA, it was heart. And this 5-year struggle, it was heart. And this heart comes from extreme faith, extreme belief in God, belief in our being God's creatures, to the point that we believe that God, human beings were made by God, especially, carefully incorporated with the elements that the creature gave to the angels. When you have a people who believe, whose faith believes that all these things that God carefully created with the angels on the first day of creation, was also given to humanity, who was created on the last day of creation. But some elements from the first day of creation, which the angels got, were also put in us. When you believe like that, when you have faith like that, then the white supremacist thinking is just a joke. It's like, nobody's going to believe it. That's why it was not believed here. That's why nobody paid attention to it. And anybody who believes that humanity, the core humanity, which belongs to white people, which belongs to Asian people, which belongs to all of us, all humanity, one color, white supremacist thinking cannot thrive in that environment. You understand? So twice Europe was defeated because of that faith that humanity is much bigger than a slave, is much bigger than a colonizable being, is much bigger than a being who could just be conquered and become your servant. This thing is in the faith that we have here, even though we don't follow it fully here. We also succumbed to the Arab thinking that we could enslave others. We also succumbed to the Arab thinking that we could make servants of others and they're inferior. And one is Baria and one is... This kind of thinking came out of the Arab world and Europe. And it was adopted here. And a lot of our current problems is a result of this faulty thinking. And instead of following our faith, we followed this thinking. White supremacist, Hamitic mythology, we're not Negroes, all that kind of thinking. We want to differentiate from Negroes, and therefore that kind of thinking is in the way of Pan-Africanism, and we have to be aware. Our belief is what God dictated. What did God dictate? All of you are one. Humanity was created. There is one father, one mother. That is like a big lesson.
So this is going to be our last question. Where is Pan-Africanism now? And how practical would it be to apply it as a form of governance?
We're talking about ADWA and its consequences. The first consequence of ADWA was a reformist phase where there was a spiritual searching that happened around the black world, including America, including South Africa, including Ghana, including Nigeria, and all over the Christian black world, the Caribbean. It even happened in Latin America.
Okay.
So, black people said, we're not inferior. Because of ADWA, this was articulated as a movement called Ethiopianism, the reformist phase. Okay, so during the reformist phase, African world got to know about each other. Okay, so that led directly into the next phase, which is the revolutionary phase, where Pan-Africanism really took root. The revolutionary phase is where a lot of Africans were getting educated in Europe, and therefore they were able to communicate, not in Africa, but in England, in New York, in different parts of the African diaspora. So the African diaspora was key to Africa's liberation. We have to understand that. So this was galvanized by the Ethiopian invasion, which happened in 1935. 1935 is when World War II started, when Ethiopia was invaded by white supremacist ideology holding. Fascism is white supremacist. So that ideology had weapons and guns and planes and came to Ethiopia to quiet down this nation which was waking up all these black movements all over the world. Even the white supremacists in America wanted Ethiopia gone. The Confederate soldiers, when Egypt invaded Emperor Yohannes, Confederate generals were part of that army. So the white supremacists had an interest in bringing Ethiopia to an end. So if we think it just started now, it's not. No. So ADWA cut that off, and then the 5-year struggle that brought an end to Mussolini in Ethiopia in 1941 brought about the revolutionary phase of the African liberation movement. The revolutionary phase of African liberation movements said, basically, in every African society, which became a country later, there were groups that arose which said, we don't want to be a colony anymore. We want to be liberated like Ethiopia. Because England acknowledged Ethiopia's liberation. When Ethiopia fought off these Italians, England came in, okay? They speak about it as if it was an England struggle. It is a 5-year hard struggle, again, by heart, which is fed by faith. So, England came last minute to mop up and saved a few Italians whose necks might have not been around if England didn't save them. So our liberation fighters had surrounded all the Italians wherever they were, and it was just a matter of time. And England saved them, gave them safe passage. So that's still white supremacy working. Even though England helped, they had a cause. So we have a cause too, which is Africa's liberation, which is Africa's freedom from colonialism. That's the second phase. Pan-Africanism was born in this struggle, and it's serious phase. 1945, Manchester, England, is when Pan-Africanism got a true, solid beginning. Who was there? Representatives from North America, such as W.E.B. Du Bois, representatives from the Caribbean, such as Marcus Garvey and Williams from Trinidad, Marcus Garvey from Jamaica, and Marcus Garvey included Harlem. And what else? You had Kwame Nkrumah there, students in England, in America. You had Jomo Kenyatta, also a student. And this gathering is a true birth of Pan-Africanism. And the ball was rolling, 1963, OAU was born. That brought about a solidification of the revolutionary phase of African liberation. Okay, so what happened? 1963 to 2013, the 50 years of African liberation, is what Kwame Nkrumah called the neo-colonial phase of African liberation struggle. And he called that the last phase of imperialism. Okay. That's Kwame Nkrumah's theory. So, neo-colonialism, the last phase of imperialism. Imperialism, the last phase of white supremacy. So, what happened 2063? We declared agenda, the AU declared Agenda 2063. So 2063 is going to come 50 years from 2013. So that's another 50-year plan. Years. So right now, Africa is being proactive. Until the neo-colonial phase ended in 2013, Africa was responding to triggers. ADWA, somebody came to attack. Colonialists come to attack, fighting neo-colonialists off, fighting white supremacy, the ideology of fighting this, fighting that. We are reacting. The reactive phase of African liberation ended 2013. So every African needs to know that 2013 we have an agenda, 50-year agenda on how Africa is going to be a middle economic country. Africa, which is going to be 30% of the world population. Africa, which controls 50% of the world's resources in different proportions, starting from 100% to 25%. So 7 things were declared in 2063.
It's a perfect place for us to actually say we have finished. I also would like to say thank you for giving us your time and celebrating 126th ADWA, victory of ADWA. And if there's anything you'd like to say, please, I give you the floor.
ADWA victory is an African victory. That's all I want to say.
Beautiful. Thank you again, everybody, for watching us. We will see you again on Saturday at 4 p.m. Thank you.